Welcome to High Impact Growth, a show from Dimagi about the role of technology in creating a world where everyone has access to the services they need to thrive. I'm Amy Vaccaro, your co-host. Today, you're going to hear from 5 of the people involved in the creation of CommCare, the leading platform for impactful frontline work everywhere. CommCare allows NGOs and governments to build applications to enable their frontline teams to deliver impactful services and collect data. Today, it would be considered one of an emerging category of low-code or no-code application builders. But we got started down the path of allowing anyone to build applications when this category was really just a nascent academic idea. And the journey to create CommCare is quite unusual. So I'm going to go out on a limb to say that the CommCare creation story that you're going to hear today has never been told in this way by the people you'll hear from today. It's a story of tenacity, humility, and continuous learning, first and foremost from our users. But before we jump in, I wanted to share a couple caveats. So first, today's show is a bit more technical than others, but I will try to break it down as we go. And second, I want to preemptively point out something that I'm sure you'll notice. In today's episode, you're going to hear from 5 North American men of a similar age who studied computer science and engineering at elite US-based institutions. This reflects the reality of Dimagi's early days. The company was founded out of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, and the earliest employees tended to be friends of the founders. Dimagi is on its own diversity, equity, and inclusion journey, which is a topic that I would love to dig in on in a future episode. But needless to say, as someone who studied psychology, not computer science, and someone who identifies as a queer female, I can attest to the progress that Dimagi has made and continues to make since our early days in becoming a more diverse and inclusive organization. One voice you won't hear from today is Gayo Mila, who was working for D-Tree International in the early days of CommCare and did a lot of the early work. I'm hopeful we can get him, as well as some of the original community health workers involved in CommCare's creation, to join on a future episode, so look out for that. Really, really excited for our show today. We've got an all-star lineup. I would usually do intros for our podcasts for each person that's speaking, but we've got a lot to cover today. So I'm just going to do super brief intros. We've got Neal Lesh, Dimagi's Chief Strategy Officer, Brian DeRenzi, Dimagi's Global Director of Research Strategy, Cory Zue, who served as Dimagi's CTO from 2007 to 2017, Clayton Sims, who is Dimagi's second CTO and current CTO, and Jonathan Jackson, Dimagi's CEO. So each of these folks were key players in the development of CommCare. Today, CommCare is the platform for impactful frontline work anywhere in the world. It's been used by 1 million people all time across 130, probably more countries. And it was really developed over time through the needs of many varying projects by leveraging project-based funding to create a high-value product. Today, we're going to talk through the stories of some of the formative projects that were involved in the creation of CommCare, and then we'll also talk through some of the learnings. So I want to start at the very beginning. I want to talk about the earliest days of Dimagi. So Dimagi was founded in 2002, and from the very beginning, we were focused on developing custom-coded projects and software for specific projects. So you've heard on previous podcast episodes about one of the very first projects we worked on, which was a national medical record system for Zambia. I want to hear from this group, what were those earliest days like? Are there any kind of anecdotes you can share with us from those days? Cory, why don't you start us off?
I kind of think of those days as almost like a bit of like a Wild West period. I think Dimagi, we were not all that discriminating in terms of the work that we took on. It was kind of like technology, generally, oftentimes mobile, but not always. Oftentimes, usually in sort of like developing world context, but not always. And so, I remember just in a span of like 4 or 5 years, I did, SMS projects in like Jordan and Zambia and Nigeria. And I was doing a health record system in Zambia, and we were doing these QR code projects in the US, but it was a little bit all over the place. And every project was different. Every project was sort of like a bespoke technology application written by software developers, usually Dimagi software developers, and delivered to our partners and our clients for sort of the needs of a very specific project in a very specific context.
Looking back on those days, the Wild West analogy definitely feels super, super correct. I think there was a very undefined scope of where we were trying to work, especially. We had like these Windows EMRs.
This is Clayton Sims speaking, and EMRs are electronic medical records
That Cory and the team were building with a lot of maturity in Zambia. There are these huge kind of national scale SMS projects. I think in one country that I worked in, we were in Zimbabwe, and we were building like a election monitoring IVR platform.
That's interactive voice response.
Based on stuff we found 2 weeks before the trip, and then built and then left and hoped that project worked out. There wasn't really like a focus. We were really trying to set like a specific course on like mobile or on SMS or on kind of touch. Like we didn't really know exactly where we had to focus. We were just trying to do good technology for people who are doing a good job without any sort of direction or long-term plan.
What point did you start to think that you needed to shift approaches to be more product focused, right? And thinking more about how do you take a kind of repeatable approach to projects?
Look, what I think was interesting is that I wouldn't say CommCare was really the initial focus on that. I mean, I think Cory and the team that was working on the Rapid SMS platform were probably the earliest folks on the team who are really trying to shift Dimagi's focus away from these kind of bespoke, very small oriented projects onto something that was kind of like a foundation we were building on. It's part of the big reason why we moved out of the project we had in Zambia was we didn't see a direction there. And I think the big reason then was that the SMS tech was maybe the more scalable. But yeah, I think Cory can probably speak pretty well to how we were thinking about that shift at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds so dumb and obvious now, but at the time we would build these projects and someone would say, could you build this thing? And we'd say, yeah, we could build that thing. And then we'd build it. And then like a year later, they would come and they would say, oh, can you modify this thing? And at that point, maybe the developer who had written it had moved on from the company. Nobody really understood how it worked, or even worse case scenarios, like a server goes down and nobody knows how to fix it. And so for me, a large part of the impetus was not really realizing that, as people say, sort of like 95% of the life cycle of a technology project happens in maintenance. And so with every single one of these little custom projects that we were building, we were creating these 95% long tail maintenance burdens. And so they were quick and easy to build. And then a year later, you're kind of supporting 15 of them, and each one kind of might draw on your time at various points. And we realized that this is a totally unsustainable way, both for Dimagi and for these organizations to be working. The organizations, like in order for us to fix the system, they would have to pay us, and software developers are expensive. And so we just kind of realized, I think for both Dimagi and for our partners, that model wasn't going to be a sustainable one.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So you built all these custom systems, and then you've got these organizations that are relying on us to fix them over time and maybe can't afford to, and it creates a huge burden for both us and the organizations. So one of the first projects where you really started to take that more product approach was a project in Tanzania in 2008. And I'm curious to hear, what was this project about? What were we trying to do? Let's start with you, Neal.
Well, I think a lot of the work that we did that led to CommCare actually started out in more of a project style work similar to the other work we had done. In fact, I came into this through an organization that wasn't Dimagi, through D-Tree International, founded by Mark Mitchell. And he had this big vision of using computers, or handheld computers, PDAs, personal digital assistants back then, to improve the care that nurses in facilities were given. And he and I got some grants to start this work. Actually, the first grants were in South Africa, and we subcontracted out to Dimagi to build those. And those original projects, which were done on PDAs, were really just, I'd say like they were projects demonstrating the idea of walking health providers digitally through protocols in remote settings to improve the quality of care. And then during that work, we started to see the potential of applying that same idea to community health workers. So the first sort of CommCare project was in Tanzania, where D-Tree eventually, or had set up its headquarters, and it was to do a similar idea, except not with nurses in facilities, but with community health workers doing home-to-home visits. But even then, curious how others remember it, but I would say it started out as kind of just a project or a cool thing to try. And at least from like my perspective, and Brian worked on a bunch of the early stuff, it didn't like yet have a product focus. That came a little bit later once we saw the potential of it.
Yeah, I'd say just from the tech side, one funny thing that jumps out is, to speak just how much to our uncertainty about whether this was like the long-term plan. When we did all those older projects that Neal was mentioning on the PDAs, we had these Windows mobile PDAs that really were like very mature, very like advanced, like little computers, right? Brian and I were kind of working in Amtora, I think, but we were like one time at this project site, and we were like clinical protocols that were used by like doctors, like in a clinical setting. And it was like a real thick computer that had to plug it in at the end of the day. And then I remember we were in a car talking about shifting over to like mobile phones, and the drop in technical sophistication that we had to eat going from these like Windows mobile PDAs that like you program like a first class device that felt like it was like really something like a doctor could use, to these little phones. Like I was talking to John, I was talking to Neal, and we were like, are you all sure that like this is the trade we want to make? Like we're losing 80% of like the user interface, of like the memory, like all these things. And they're like, can the phone talk to like the internet? We have the like data signals, at the time it was like really novel. And I was like, yeah, kind of like there's like a little bit of data on the device that we can get out, but like it doesn't work super reliably. And they're like, that's it. Like that's what we need to plan around. That's what we need to build around. Like these are it. You can get them where we're going, and I could talk to the internet. Like that's what's important. And I was like, all right, you guys are in charge. I don't know if that sounds like the right decision as a coder, but like turned out that was a pretty big trade-off.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. So were these Nokia like flip phones at that point in time, or what kind of phones were these?
They were 2000 models, I think.
This is Jonathan Jackson, Dimagi's CEO, speaking.
And I remember everybody in our field sites had the exact same Nokia brick phone at the time. There's just like one model that we all had, but there was a long knowledge base inside of Dimagi, like by every single Nokia model and what type of apps it could run on it, because it was so specific back then, what those phones were capable of. But those models were great. Like those phones they lasted forever. The batteries were amazing. The Nokia really got that genre of phone extremely well built.
Yeah, I remember those. I think I had one of those as well. So continuing with you, Clayton, you're talking about sort of the technology that you had to shift to. I think you talked a lot about the learnings from that period around the challenges of working in a remote setting, and really kind of feeling the pain of users. Can you tell us a little bit more about what was that like, kind of building technology in really remote places?
When we were building CommCare back in like 2009, the way we were building the tech had a lot of the same technical limitations as the context that users were in, right? We were in this house in Dar that we were building the software in with Drew and Brian and Joakim and Gaio and some of these folks from T-Tree. We were some of the earliest adopters of distributed version control systems like Git, because we had to share code with each other inside the house on our Wi-Fi. We like had to do our own kind of like Git pushes to our own Git repo, because we didn't have the ability to kind of like go out to like a server outside of anytime we had to sync an image to a server outside of the house, it was like super annoying. Like we had to add an image to the repository. We're like, all right, everybody, like stop using the internet for 25 minutes because we have to like upload this one file to our distributed version control server. And I think like that really like it shaped a lot of how we kind of think about like a phone that needs to be able to do what it needs to do without the internet and then use it when it has it available. Like we learned a lot from that. And I think we also learned a little bit how hard it is to socialize that for people who haven't had that experience, right? So I remember a researcher that came to work with D-Tree, and they, we used to buy our internet on these like dongles that we'd like share, we'd like pass around, and like one of us would use the internet at a time. And they had one of these dongles that we bought 500 megs a month on or something like that. And they didn't really understand how this worked. And like, they came to the house the first night, watched The Daily Show for like an hour, and then came and were like, hey, we like, this like stopped working. Do you know why? And we're like, oh yeah, you blew through the entire month's internet like allocation in the last 45 minutes. Like, it's very hard when you haven't had that kind of intuitive experience to like really understand it. So I think that really like shaped a lot of how we think of CommCare and we think about offline, and it's really carried forward to this day.
Yeah, no, that's such a hilarious story. And yeah, I do see that to today. Like that's one of our key differentiators, is the fact that CommCare is so usable offline and on. So Brian, I wanted to ask you a bit about, you were obviously there in those early days in Tanzania. What were the first CommCare users like, and what did you learn from them?
So I did a lot of the field work for CommCare. I spent a lot of time, I spent a few months in Uganda. I had a Fulbright in Tanzania where I was there for a year, and then I spent a few months on kind of either side of that. There was a time in CommCare where I had a personal relationship with every single CommCare user, which was really nice. Like they were all, for probably the first 30, 40, 50 users, I had some like deep connection to them. We would talk about their kids when we got together and sit down, my time in 2008, 2009, doing a lot of this field work. And it was impressive how much people cared about the work that they were doing. The digital support tool was important. We were trying to make their job easier, but it was just a small part of the larger mission and the larger work that they were doing. I mean, I remember, doing home visits with a community health worker, and we were walking through these mountains going from house to house, and he would just sit down and talk to people, and that social connection and that social presence was the most important thing. And so our job, I think, as we were building the tool, was to build a tool that could enable them to collect and organize the information and support the work that they're doing, but do it in a way that was as close to invisible as possible, so that the important social connection pieces really still shone through.
That's really powerful what you just shared, Brian. And I feel like that kind of underscores some of the humility with which we have had to and have approached our work, and just really knowing that, yeah, the app that a community health worker is using is just a fraction of their experience, right? And it needs to be as seamless as possible and actually contribute to making their days easier and better.
And I do want to call it a little bit, I can't speak enough to, there's a lot of discussion about the concept of participatory design and kind of inclusive design. And I can't articulate enough how having that kind of formative experience and relationship really was for us, because it's a huge draw on those people's time back in that period to kind of go out of their way. We tried to kind of schedule around meetings they were already having, but, Brian would schedule time with those folks. We would come out from, further in Dar and like sit down and do, design sessions, do paper prototyping sessions, do physical feedback sessions. I know a huge amount of the design we finally landed on really came from being able to get hours and hours of those folks' time kind of contributing and like giving their experience about how it went to use something and like their ideas about what to shift and how to work on things. And I think we've had the chance to have that experience, a number of times in our kind of history building CommCare and designing, but it really is, a participatory design session that was a draw from those people's time, and they deserve a huge amount of credit for contributing to that and being willing to work with us and kind of contributing to that and driving that forward for our other users and our other needs.
Yeah, and to build on that, Clayton, I think the other major factor that participatory design caused was increasing our confidence that our users actually wanted this. This was 2008, 2009. We were already gaining a lot of concern and skepticism on the value some of our work and the industry's work was providing to providers. And so when I went to Tanzania and, was talking to Brian, and I could just tell by talking to Brian, he's like, oh no, we're onto something here. Like these users really want this and are excited by technology, and it's helping them. Like, yes, there's a huge amount of work we have to do to improve the software and make this better, but like at its core, this is a user base that like I really think we should be focusing on, and this technology really can make an impact. Whereas when we'd go to visit some of the clinics we were supporting or other use cases, we're like, this may not be the most desired solution and desired work we're doing. And that you wouldn't know that unless you are deeply in the field doing this participatory design. And as Brian mentioned, like having deep personal connections with these users to understand, is this actually making their jobs better?
Yeah, and on the design point, I think on the academic side, there's lots of different names, and they're all slightly different. There's participatory design, and there's user-centered design and human-centered design, and then there's design thinking, and there's co-design. My point is there are all these different types of design, and they're all slightly different takes on the same thing, which is you have to engage with the user, you have to have that personal connection. And as we were kind of exploring and doing this, and we used a bunch of different techniques, whether it was focus groups, or, Clayton mentioned some of the paper prototyping that we did. All of these techniques you kind of pull together, and you try to engage the user, engage the human of the user in this process in a way to create something that's actually useful for them. And Dimagi calls it design under the mango tree, and there's actually a mango tree. We had this site in southern, just south of Dar es Salaam, that we would go to once a week. We're working with these community health workers, and we'd meet up at this health center. And in order to make sure we weren't in the way, we'd grab a bench and pull it outside of the health center and sit literally under a mango tree and have these feedback sessions and talk to them about the work that they're doing, talk to them about the tool, try to, give them an updated version, respond to their feedback, get their input, have them really drive a lot of the decisions that we were making in terms of how to create this tool. So when Clayton talks about the importance of those users and just the sheer number of hours that they've put in that have created this tool that's become useful for people and health workers and frontline workers more generally all over the world, there's a huge debt of gratitude that we all owe to those initial users. I look back on it very fondly. That really fantastic time with Gaio and Mhila we mentioned was a huge part of all of this under that mango tree.
I don't know if we were aware of it at the time, but there's one element of our term design under the mango tree, which is missing from the other terms that people use for something similar, which is the context and situation under which you're doing this work. I was just reading this book called The Extended Mind by, I think, Annie Murphy Paul, and it talks about how people think differently in different environments. You think differently in an office room than you do out under a mango tree.
I'll note that other methodologies do include this notion. They just don't call it out quite as much as design under the mango tree does.
And in hindsight, I think that element of doing the design work in the context that's kind of close to or closer to the setting in which the systems will be used really is an important part of our approach.
Thank you so much, Brian and Neal, for sharing that. The design under the mango tree philosophy is one of the things that actually attracted me to Dimagi when I was first considering Dimagi. And so it's just so cool to hear that origin story and also just to know that same approach, we continue to apply that same approach as we've been designing over the last 15 years. So one other question around the Tanzania time. So Neal, you shared an interesting story from that time when you had an aha moment around just how sophisticated our users were. Can you tell us a little bit about that learning that you had?
Yeah, I'd like to say it was a mistake we only made once, but I think we were very often reminded of various ways which we might underestimate our users or our clients or various people in the system. And one of them was early days working in Tanzania, and there were some different phone models we could run CommCare on. And we wanted to test out different ones. So we bought like 3 or 4 different phones, and then we had a few users and we had them swap phones, each use one phone for a few weeks and then swap and then use the other one to see which was best. And then one of them came back, one of the people using it came back who had been out using CommCare in Tanzania, going from house to house. And he reported that one of the clients, an elderly man, as I recall, was upset when the client saw that the CommCare user had a different phone than the previous visit. And the concern that the guy said was that, oh, you typed my data into that other phone. Where's that other phone? Where's my data? And I think our first reaction was just kind of amusement or bemusement that we hadn't seen it at all. And then realized that, oh yeah, people have a more sophisticated attitude towards data, towards privacy concerns than we expected, especially back then. Now that might not be surprising, but I think back when we were doing this, we thought, oh, we're bringing this very new kind of magical technology in, and hadn't realized how quickly people would understand it and how think about all these different aspects themselves. So it was a good reminder, which happened many times in different ways.
Yeah, thank you, Neal. And I think that's that theme of taking data privacy and security really seriously is something that sticks with us to today. It probably would have come about anyways, but it's just interesting to hear the ways in which those early conversations have really set us up and created certain underpinnings of how we approach our work at Dimagi. And I imagine Clayton will have a future episode where we really dig in on data security and privacy, because that is something we think about a lot. Just to kind of recap where we've been, we talked a little bit about very earliest days. We had a number of projects. We were kind of approaching each project with sort of bespoke software. we started shifting into more of a product approach with CommCare and kind of testing that out both in Uganda as well as Tanzania. Do you remember, was there like a moment in time when you really like made that decision to switch from custom to software? And how did you think about that? And I guess this is a question for Cory.
I don't think I'm the right person to answer this question, because I think I was, at the time, I was the biggest skeptic that this could ever possibly work. And
that's interesting.
I mean, I'd had so much experience building these custom projects, and they all seemed very complex. Everybody's workflows were different, as we just heard. We wanted to do a lot of user-centered design and really create, the right solution for the right context. And it just didn't strike me as realistic that we'd be able to pull off building a product that could actually sort of provide the right value for the people on the ground without sort of like an infinite budget and an infinite amount of time. But I was very happy to be wrong, and so probably someone who was making the case for doing that should answer this question properly.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of skepticism. Cory wasn't alone, because one of the strengths we had at that time as an organization was this massive amount of customization we were doing on all of our projects to make them successful. But there was a moment in time, this was around 2008, 2009, that we were starting to get going with this. And so there was two major events and trends that we were experiencing at the time. One was, it was kind of obvious mobile phones were going to explode. Not smartphones yet, but just Nokia device. So it was very obvious there's going to be huge adoption of mobile phones and that they were going to be internet enabled. The second was the United States at the time was going through the Great Recession. So we're looking around and kind of everybody's rethinking what does work mean to them? What's going to happen in this economy? Like everything had just crashed. And I pulled the team together and I was kind of like, look, we're going all in on having a scalable pathway to impact. And at that point, I wasn't saying that means product, but we kind of knew what we were doing with these massive custom solutions that users kind of wanted a little bit. Wasn't necessarily the path to massive impact. And we knew we were going to, succeed or die trying. And finally, aid, particularly in the Great Recession, I think less so currently, was very countercyclical. So a ton of funding came out from donors and governments to push aid and global development. So that recession was good for a lot of the smaller players in the sector. And I made a conscious decision, and we all executed it, to really push and say, what is that path to scale? That's why we started doing a lot of open source products at the same time. So it wasn't this kind of SaaS product vision yet, but it was, we need to pick fewer platforms, focus more on those, and see if we can create scalable and enduring value. And to Cory's point, like, this was not obvious that it was going to work. But what was obvious was the current path we were on wasn't going to lead to reaching 1 billion users or 1 billion clients. And so that was where a lot of this came from. And we didn't completely focus on CommCare right away. It was one of several open source bets we were making. But then very quickly, we completely aligned on going all in on CommCare in the next year or two.
Yeah, one thing that really jumps out to me about that kind of period and that transition, to Cory's point, I think it took a while for any of us to be super convinced that there was going to be like a product or like a concept of something that was totally reusable. And so much of the foundations that we were building that eventually became the kind of inlets to product and to kind of a SaaS, user self-service model really came from the tools that we built to like make our lives a little bit easier. We built these external specifications for being able to codify our protocols or codify what an app can do, not to make it so we could build an app builder on a website, but because we didn't want to have to go change code over and over. Brian and I were building the protocols in Mtwara back on those Windows mobile devices. The whole protocol was in code. So every time we had to change it, we had to do a whole new build, which is a very different thing from putting a new single file that was, your text file that represents the protocol. So, that's the kind of stuff that really ended up eventually transitioning and blooming into this product-driven approach. But I'd say it was very incremental, and it was opportunistic that we eventually were able to leverage that into that product-driven approach. But we always did have a little bit of a focus of, I guess, almost think of it like a pyramid of how difficult each part of the problem was, where, we wanted to make it the case that someone like Brian, who's really an expert on the protocol and on what the users need, could go make that change without needing to recompile the code. Because I think at the time, the tech challenges were way harder than they are now to just get something that could run on a mobile device. So, we were trying to putting the right problem in the hands of the right people was always part of our technology goal. But the notion you could turn that into something that was end user serviceable still felt like a decade away or something like that.
And if I could add in addition to it being kind of a Wild West mood back then, it was a really idealistic time. There's a lot of interest of people forming open source communities. I think the idea of like a big vision was like, even though we were like tiny and just starting, the idea of having your system used everywhere was like kind of easy or common or natural to think about. Like, it was very ambitious, very bold. And a lot of reality and maturity has set in over the last decade. But back then, I think we had that kind of big vision for it. And I think that was there before like the idea of achieving it through a product or a no-code platform.
So when was the first time anyone said CommCare? Like, how did that name come about?
We had decided to do a retreat in 2009 over the holidays with Neal and I and some others that had worked on this. And I think Brian was still in Tanzania, so was iterating on a document with us remotely. And I just remember like, okay, I think we're going to do this product thing with this technology that Clayton and Brian and Dietrich and Dimagi and others had been working on, but we didn't have a name for it yet. And then I just remember seeing the title of the document switch one day. And I don't remember if it was Brian or Neal who had come up with the title, but it was like CommCare. And I was like, oh, that's perfect. That's it. So my vantage point of it was just one day, the title of this document that was the pre-read, it was like a 13-page document. We were going to go spend all day talking about it and just switch one day. And then that was the name of the product. I have a very funny story about my ability to name things that Jillian stopped that we'll share in a later branding episode.
Oh boy, looking forward to that one.
Yeah, I'll see if anybody else has an earlier story, but I think the precursor to what John described was I was writing a proposal to Microsoft for $100,000 that was going to be submitted by Gaetano Borriello, our partner at the University of Washington, and was writing up a few-page thing. I believe I was in East Africa somewhere, kind of like writing it up quick to send off, and then realized it would just be simpler to describe all this if I gave it a name. And so into that document, I wrote CommCare, I think in that first version with just one M, and sent it off. And I think that's the first time I ever wrote down that word. That's my memory.
And Neal has a history of prolific, irrevocable names, if I recall, because I know that we also, one of the early, what we thought was going to be disruptive innovations of CommCare was an interface where you would answer questions and the history of your kind of question answering would stay on the screen and kind of, float up almost like a chat interface. And we probably argued, you'd think we would have argued for years about the name CommCare or something like that. We actually spent probably 7 months arguing about what we were going to call that interface. And I think Neal at some point flippantly called it Chatterbox. And John and I were like, that's the worst name in the world. We are not calling this thing Chatterbox. That sounds like juvenile. It's like really silly. We'd argue and we went to this, there's a really big Java Rose retreat, which was the name of the specifications group that we worked with at the time, which is a bunch of great people who all have kind of produced really good artifacts into the space. In the cab, I think on the way to there, we were arguing with that. We finally decided you know what, Neal, you're right. It's Chatterbox. And then of course, Chatterbox turned out to be the least good design principle of the entire thing. And we spent the next 3 years dialing it back little by little by little until everybody got the one question on the screen they wanted. But at least we had that prominent name finally.
I love productizing everything, and actually, Cory, as you were talking, it reminded me we had this narrative that we just made this great bet on CommCare and it worked out perfectly. But I tried to productize everything we were doing at the time, much to all of the engineers dismay and horror. And a lot of that didn't work and caused a lot of extra churn, some of our supply chain capabilities, some of our SMS projects at the time. And so that we had that notion of wanting to productize stuff, but I was fairly indiscriminate at that period of time of trying to just find anything we could productize, because I did have a pretty strong notion that was going to need to be part of our path to success. But what Cory was alluding to earlier on the need to customize, that was also very true. We kept running and supporting massive custom projects for quite some time after that were legacy projects. And one of them is still running today at national scale, powering a supply chain. It's great and cost effective and is amazing technology.
Okay, I just learned, Neal, that you named CommCare and nobody pushed back on it. It just happened.
Brian, I thought you also were, did you add the M?
I might have added the M. I was part of the proposal, the University of Washington Microsoft research proposal that Neal was mentioning. I often fix Neal typos in documents and improve spelling here and there, so I might have added an M.
Yeah, I appreciate you adding that M. I think it would really bother me if there was just one M.
So Cory, I want to ask you then, like you were a skeptic, and that makes sense because you and I were actually much more on the custom side of the house at this time. What kind of experiences or learnings did you have at that time that kind of made you think, okay, maybe John's not crazy, or maybe that this could get to scale?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think so. This is maybe skipping around a little bit now, but so for a long time, Brian and Clayton were doing a lot of, I don't know if you'd call it productization, but kind of making the mobile side of the house require a lot less software development and kind of more configurability. And I was mostly focused on the server side where we didn't have a lot of that stuff. And I remember at one point during my skepticism, we got donated or something. There was some Google engineer, I think his name was Ross, and he had like a 3 or 4 week hiatus from Google, and he wanted to do some do-gooding. So we were like, okay, let's give this guy a project. And in that period, he built this sort of like website where you could, I think he added it to whatever we were doing on our servers, but where you could basically go in and you could sign up for an account, and you could choose a project name. We called it a domain, and then you could kind of have this place where you still couldn't really like build a CommCare app, but you could at least have this little place where you could then upload some CommCare configuration files and have your data go there. And I remember just thinking like, oh my God, this is such a waste of time and money. Like why, who, like the number of people that are going to sign up, like nobody is going to sign up for this. How could this possibly be a good idea? We got this Google engineer and we're like wasting his time doing this stupid thing. And then I remember like we had I don't even know if we had a mailing list at that point, or it might have been sort of one of a more general mailing list for the open source community. But someone was sort of like, I want to, do something kind of exactly like what Ross had, but I want to like host this application. How do I do that? And then I was like, whoa, like there are people out there in the world that want to do this and maybe be able to help them. And I think for a long time, we probably, you could count on maybe one hand or two hands for years the number of projects that were using this thing. And every time someone signed up, it would be like fist pumping in the office, and we'd like go follow up with them on email and find out all about their project and stuff like that.
HQ, was that the beginning of CommCare HQ?
Yeah, CommCare HQ was what we were calling the web side of CommCare, where you would send your data and you could have maybe some really basic reports and download it to Excel. And eventually we added, the application builder and all these other no-code tools so that you could actually author and manage CommCare applications on there. But at the time it was basically a place to sort of like upload your configuration files and download your data.
Yeah, and one thing that is kind of funny to think back to, so the previous CommCare HQ was something called Data HQ, which is the server we were running before that was just for receiving data. That was in John's HQ phase, where all of our products had to have HQ at the end. I think there was like Care HQ and Data HQ and something else HQ that never was a real product. And what's funny about it is like it seems so obvious and intuitive that like you'd have like an end-to-end experience through this, where you could like build an app or deploy an app and that it would be like a SaaS product. But like the problems that we had to solve in between Data HQ and like having something on a phone that you could do end to end were like almost insurmountable. Like I think John paid 4 people to build like the form builder that like everybody uses now, that we take for given. Granted, it's like a thing you could obviously build that work fine. And like the old versions of the form builder were like a literal joke. Like there were pages on our wiki that were like, here's what could go wrong with the form builder. And it would outline, like, if you like move a question the wrong way, everything's broken, you have to start over. So like copy and paste everything every 4 minutes in the form. It was a total, and like, I think that's one thing that's really funny to think about from the product path is like, it was a little bit of like initiative and a little bit of aspirational kind of like thinking to get each of those little pieces in place. Danny Roberts, who's now our kind of like leads our SaaS technology team, he built the app builder kind of over in the corner without like telling anyone. Like he said, like, hey, like we're gonna go, like, what if we could like go design menus and like forms like on our own, like in the website? Like, can you like go try to do that? And he's like, yeah, I'll try to do that and like not tell anybody because like this seems crazy. Like we keep trying to do this and it doesn't work. It's like I think that's one thing that really jumps out to me is that so many of these problems were so hard to solve, and now we take it as a grant for given that you could solve them. But I don't think that was true at the time, and I think John would reflect that back on the fourth person he paid to get the form builder to work.
Well, and I think that the interesting thing, I was just meeting with a bunch of our partners over the last couple of days in Washington, D.C., and I talked a lot about this. So now this whole industry vertical of multi-billion-dollar companies building low-code, no-code platforms exists because everybody recognizes the potential power and efficiency of non-engineers being able to build apps for themselves or for their companies. Back then, nobody was doing this. So I think it's interesting to reflect on how early that was, because that term low-code, no-code came out much later in the 2010s as a whole big genre of software. Now it's massive and exploding. But back when we were first doing this wasn't even a thesis that necessarily everybody agreed with was something that could work. And I think that was a huge undertaking and challenge for us that I think we did, to Clayton's point, underestimate how hard it would be to build some of these tools and technologies. And also this interacted with our open source participation in a very interesting way, because this is one of the key areas that a lot of the community diverged in our opinions of what was the right path to scale. Should it be the case that we're building open source libraries that engineers can use? Should it be the case that we're building open source apps that software engineers can use? Or should it be the case that we're building products that non-engineers can use? And we all had different opinions on it. And therefore it really started to diverge where the different companies that were collaborating at that time wanted to take things. And I think that was a really healthy debate. And it actually solidified a lot of our opinions and made us realize where we did disagree. And it was great because then we all realized we needed to take different technology approaches.
I think one thing that jumps out to me as we talk about this kind of product versus kind of custom debate, I think one thing that's kind of funny to reflect on is I think how much the non-productized approach that we took in the beginning here was really kind of important to the product that we eventually made. Because when we take for granted now this idea that, we have like these cases, we have, the ability, I remember one of the big capabilities we needed at the time was to have cases and referrals, right? In the early projects that were working on Pathfinder, there were cases that represented people who were receiving services. And then there was another model that we tracked that managed when somebody had to get referred to a clinic, and that had its own life cycle. And so the notion, we worked with this big consortium, this Java ROSA consortium, and we were all working on Xforms.
Xform is a specification used to represent a data collection form.
We were all collaborating on being able to, use the same open source engine that we were trying to work on between a couple of partners and us. And I think the big differentiating factor for CommCare at the time wasn't no code, low code. It wasn't our product. It was that we were tracking data over time because we needed to do this for these Pathfinder projects. And it wasn't just one piece of data. It was kind of these multiple pieces of data. We needed both a person and a referral. And as we shifted into the product world, we had to retain those things that we were doing. We had to still be able to do this really complicated thing of tracking this data and tracking it over time. And all the other partners were like, you guys are crazy. Like, we get our form, we send it off the device, we're done. Like, you're never going to be able to like scale being able to track the data, because like you have to migrate it. You have to update the device. So I sat up at like 2 a.m. one time with this guy from Grameen who's using CommCare because he needed to update the data on his phones, and he had to send me the files. So, it's one of these sort of like, those things were really hard to do, and we never would have done them if we were trying to build a product. We would never have like taken on that much complexity. So I think we really benefited from this really, to Neal's point, ambitious, very aspirational approach, not being very product focused initially, because we bit off a problem that was so hard. We never would have bit it off if we were trying to do an MVP, or if we were trying to use modern techniques to kind of build something. And I think that's worth kind of like reflecting on and appreciating how much it was a synthesis of those two kind of approaches of doing something really ambitious, really aspirational, really complex, and then also having to productize it. And I think that's been the big kind of secret sauce, or kind of theory of like what drove what, but eventually was something so powerful and so unique. But I think it took a lot of skill to get there, because you needed Simons, or you needed these very skilled people who could take what all of us kind of set up for them and then turn it into something that's viable. And that was, we got lucky, to be candid, that we could find such intelligent, such great people who were actually able to turn that into something like a product.
because we were focused on these specific projects with really hard challenges, we were able to go super deep on those specific projects and then bring that over into this product approach over time. And had we just started with like, yeah, we want a product that's going to serve all NGOs and governments, and we would have built something way more lightweight that wouldn't have been able to handle the complexity that we were able to handle and still are. I think that's super cool. So we've talked a lot about kind of the very earliest days, the shifting to a more product approach, the even sort of starting to shift from just a product to a product that would actually allow folks to build, right? Non-technical folks to build. The next moment in time I wanted to speak about was a project with World Vision. This was in Afghanistan in 2011. Clayton, can you tell us a little bit about this project? What was it about? Kind of set the scene for us.
Yeah, sure. So I think, this is a really interesting example of some of the growing pains, I think, for us in that transition from trying to solve kind of the hardest problems and trying to work directly with people into realizing that maybe we needed to take a step back and we needed to kind of like generalize a little bit about where we were headed. So we were working with World Vision in Herat in Afghanistan. We were trying to build a system for community members who are community healthcare workers who are trying to screen for high-risk pregnancies. So we had a tool that kind of managed members of the community and helped them do a screening and then gave them an outcome and then helped them do referrals to kind of get folks who were at higher risk during delivery to get preemptive care. And it was a really challenging environment because the community healthcare workers we were working with were illiterate and enumerate. So, couldn't read what was on the phone and then also couldn't kind of use numbers to kind of track things. And so we wanted to adapt the interface all the way down to the idea that CommCare works for everyone, no matter who you are. So we built this very multimedia heavy interface. So Rowena, Luke and Drew Rose and I, who'd kind of like each did a trip. So we had 3 people go out for weeks at a time to kind of do user design, to sit down with folks. And we built this whole interface where everything was audio driven. You didn't press up and down even because a lot of our community health workers are older and they didn't have kind of the dexterity to only press the middle button on the phone. They would like always accidentally also press the bottom button. It would like change what they did accidentally. And so we like spent just weeks and weeks and weeks kind of iterating and like turning off like navigation on the phone and locking it down and making so every prompt like read an audio prompt out loud and there was an image on the screen and then you press the center button to advance. And it was kind of onerous, but like people used it. And I'm very, I think I come from a human computer interaction background, and I think it's probably one of our biggest successes at making our technology reach all the way down to the hardest kind of like last mile kind of setting. And our goal was we were like, this is amazing. We did such great work. This is so cool. The users actually used that app, I think, for 2 years after the project ended. Like I would go look at our HQ and see that people would still submit forms. I was like super, super excited, super proud of it. And so Neal's like, this is a product, like this CommCare Sense, like this is going to reach the last mile. It's going to get out there. Everyone's going to love it. They want this multimedia. We're like, we really built something amazing here. And we had these other projects with World Vision in Mozambique. And then I think maybe in India. And we're like, here's CommCare Sense. It works for people who like have, low literate populations. And those little populations kind of looked at it like, this is really clunky. It's like super hard to use. Like, how come these up and down buttons don't work? And we're like, oh, it's because that's like a thing people have a hard time. Like, we don't have a hard time with this at all. Like, we just want the images. So we like had to scale back, like incrementally, like we just like took away all this like amazing work we did like piece by piece by piece until CommCare Sense mode was just like, they're images now, or like that's audio. Cause like these people were super savvy. They use phones all the time. They just like couldn't read a lot of the text on the screen. And like, that's fine. That wasn't an issue they had. So I think we learned a little bit about, kind of like, we can solve hard problems. We can't get all the way down. We can like do these really tricky things, but like that, it's not all these user populations are the same. Not all forms of literacy are the same. Not all the users have the same set of challenges. And like, it was a real wake up call that we needed to kind of like think through a little more generally, like which hard problems are important to solve and like what is the more general thing that we need to do if we're going to take this from something that helps us solve one really hard problem to something that helps us solve, 1,000 or 1,000,000 really hard problems around the world.
And my memory, I think, has been a little bit selective, but what I really took away from that whole story was the element of CommCare Sense that survived was really this big breakthrough that exploded kind of the range of what CommCare can do, which is because that's where we picked up the idea of adding in multimedia images and audio clips to the CommCare app. And the motivation was to allow the low literate users to be able to use CommCare. Like they just couldn't use it when it was all text-based. And this was like a way to let them use it. And then when deployed that in India, the Dimagi team using it kind of came back. It was like, I remember like these kind of frenzied emails, this kind of confused emails and saying like, oh, the community health workers, I think we were working with Ashas in India, they're showing their phone to their clients. Like they're playing the audio for them, for the clients. They're showing those images to the clients to like reinforce their behavior change communication. That really wasn't on our radar prior as like a way that CommCare would be used. It was much more like a paper form that we were digitizing, where like, you can imagine like a paper form on a clipboard, somebody's asking questions, but they're not like showing that form to the client. And it's really opened up a lot of possibilities that at least I hadn't seen coming. It took us a while to come to grips with it. It was only because we were working closely enough with the users that we even understood this was happening. It raised questions about like what type of audio and images do you want to use that are going to be most compelling as behavior change tools for the clients. So there are many dimensions to this work that came out of Afghanistan.
That's really cool. I mean, so that's a story of basically learning from our users, right? We were thinking about multimedia in one specific way, and then we saw how users were actually using it to help inform their conversations with their clients, and that opened the door to how multimedia is even used in CommCare to this day.
Exactly. And from my memory, it was like a bit of a slow learning. And we were first went through confusion and then learning, seeing how our users were realizing that they could use these tools.
We've heard such incredible stories today, kind of along the journey of learning from our users and developing CommCare. And, the sort of next phase on this arc was really opening up CommCare so that it could be that no-code, low-code platform that John was talking about. Everyone on this call here, where you guys are all computer scientists, I believe, and sort of taking CommCare forward so that non-CS folks can build on CommCare. When was the first time that you saw someone without a CS background able to build an app on CommCare? And tell us a little bit about that journey.
I think in the very early days, I'm curious to hear what other people say to this, but I think in the very early days, we were quite keen to get non-computer science, but still technical people. So people who didn't have a strong coding background, but still had some technical expertise, to get them to build applications. And we did it by, I remember running a bunch of trainings, sometimes with Clayton, sometimes with Drew, who was another Dimagi employee at the time, or by myself, and running these trainings, explaining how to manually, how to open up Notepad and manually create an X form and manually add different questions and question types, and how to implement skip logic, and make sure that your data model's updated correctly, all of these things. And I felt like we got to a point where like we had kind of a standard training and a standard set of slides, at least I did, that I would run through and try to get people kind of upskilled. And, this was long before the XLS to Xform or any of the CommCare app builder or anything like that. And so I think even from those early days, it was our intention and it was our desire to empower people to build applications to solve their own problems. And we didn't have the no-code authoring tools at that time, but we still had that intention, and we still tried to give people the skills and the ability to do that.
And building on what Brian said, going back to the open source point, everybody in the community at this time had a thesis of like, less hardcore engineering needs to happen in order for more adoption to happen. And the question was like where you were drawing that line. And as we mentioned earlier, like a lot of us internally had very different lines of what we thought was feasible. But we also went through a big organizational change at around this time when our backend was starting to get good enough that people could build apps completely within the CommCare ecosystem. And we had built out a new program within Dimagi called our Field Manager program. And this was hiring people to be full-time in the field, working directly with our projects and programs and users, and building CommCare apps on their own. And this was when they had a lot of rough edges that they were hitting, as Cory and Clayton were talking about earlier, but were able to, start to build their own apps. And that also unlocked a different business model for Dimagi, because up until that point in time, you would typically hire Dimagi because you wanted to buy our software engineering skills. And then we would use those budgets to piece together the budget to build CommCare. And it flipped so that you could actually hire our team to help you implement a solution, but not pay for any engineering costs. You were just paying for support in building your app. And that positive feedback loop for us as an organization also caused our internal users to start to become our customers too. So our field managers who were using CommCare were driving a huge amount of the requirements into what we needed to make possible on the mobile application and what we had to improve in the back end, because they were out in the field working with our partners and running into all these issues or opportunities to make more powerful applications.
Yeah, and it resonates a lot with me, what Brian kind of said about like in some ways it feels like more aspirational our users can do anything kind of approach in the past than we kind of landed on eventually when we productized a little bit more and we thought of it a little bit more as an end-to-end experience, because we were really focused on reaching folks who were technically inclined or who just had expertise in general and providing them with a way to digitize something, and I think that was the big goal of the entire kind of DeRenzi consortium or OpenRosa consortium. And it was the entire kind of motivation for almost everyone who's kind of working in the space at the time. That was always the goal, was really to kind of like get that expertise in people's hands. That was very aspirational at the time. And it was a very non-linear path to us being able to reach that to a fully web-based experience. I mean, for years, we had an end-to-end experience in CommCare HQ where someone could build an app in CommCare, but where our most serious apps or our most like advanced apps or our flagship programs, they were still built by Matt Thies or, someone in the company, Amelia Segoff, people who we had these employees at the company who were still building manual X forms and were still building these kind of XML documents to like make these more complicated experiences for our, big flagship programs.
Chiming in here to define XML, which stands for Extensible Markup Language. It's a text-based and human-readable file format for moving data around.
And it was actually a really, really big transition. One of the biggest ones that jumps out for me was when we launched our biggest flagship program for the very first time, fully on CommCare HQ, not with an app that somebody kind of like then hard-coded and then customized and then like gone that extra 10% to make it in an X form. That was, for me, the really big transition. And that didn't happen for 4 or 5 years after we'd kind of launched the idea of this product and that end-to-end experience. We launched a large program in India that was based on what we used to call previously were remote applications, which were what we called when somebody would link over to the hard-coded XML, which is that was a real app. In our mind, there was like this stuff you can build in HQ and then there's a remote app, and a remote apps are like the real business. And I think Matt Thies had spent months and months and months transitioning an app we had previously made as a remote app into an app we built in HQ fully. And I think for me, that was probably around 2016, something like that. Like that was probably the first real time I was like, oh, this is like a product. Like what we build now is the first class thing. And we can kind of like take a step back and like stop as engineers feeling like we're really in the loop for our biggest program now. Now I really believe that like the people who can build the biggest programs or the most scalable programs or Dimagi's most important programs are not engineers. Now we've kind of pushed that down one level, but that was, 8 years after, we were already having folks in the field doing that for the first time on XML.
So 8 years between sort of the first time we built something that we called CommCare to a time when we felt like somebody could actually build on CommCare, which just, to me, speaks to like the level of effort that has gone into CommCare, right? In terms of going back to what you were saying earlier, Clayton, around products that come out these days that are, trying to compete with CommCare. They're being built as MVPs, right? These lightweight things meant to solve one specific problem. And, the beauty of CommCare is that it was built solving really hard problems over time. And today, like, allows people to solve a host of problems.
Yeah, and in a way, you could kind of describe the entire history of like the CommCare product as just transitioning pieces of the stack from developers to like highly technical users making config files to like really hard to use interface to like usable. And we started with just the bare bones and the whole product. And even today, there's features lurking in there that you probably can't use unless you're in one of the modes that's below sort of like usable interface on the website. But over time, we've transitioned more and more of the product through that cycle up to a point where anybody can build off it. And I think now, when we're building new things, I think we're kind of a lot more disciplined about sort of staying in that higher world, because we recognize that that's where the overwhelming majority of the value gets created for our users and for our customers. But it took a long time to get there.
A point I remember is writing a proposal, another proposal. I think this time it was to USAID's Development Innovation Ventures program. I think it was our first round. We were quickly submitting a short proposal, and we said, we were trying to figure out like what to propose. And we said, we'll propose launching 5 CommCare projects in India in a year. And we submitted it we submitted it having no idea how we would do it, is my memory. Like, we didn't know how we would get the partners. We didn't know how we would do the tech. We didn't know who would implement it. And back then that was the kind of way we were operating in general, was crash land ourselves into certain big projects and push forward goals. And then I think that forced a lot of the productization or early stages to like do something that would allow us to launch 5 projects in such a short time back.
So as I'm just reflecting on this journey, I feel like the other thing that came out of, making CommCare buildable, right, was, and this was started with that field manager program that John mentioned, is that Dimagi today is unique in that it has both this large, really strong tech team, but also a really strong, we call it our solutions delivery team, right? And these are folks that are building on CommCare. And at the same time, we heard in previous episodes from Marina about sort of our partner ecosystem too, right? Where we're really trying to enable and empower the tech ecosystem to build on CommCare. So just kind of multiple layers of ways that we're hoping that this technology can really have as much impact as possible. Neal, I think what you just said is actually a really good segue because the next episode, we're going to be digging in on the USAID Div work. So for folks in the audience, they'll be hearing more about that story of some of that early funding and how we were able to test and prove out CommCare through that funding. I know that Clayton also mentioned some work in India, and we'll also have a future episode kind of digging in on some of that work in India and some of the learnings and the heartbreaks there. Before I wrap, is there anything that folks didn't get to say that they wanted to say?
As we were talking about this episode and this conversation, I was reflecting back on some of the earliest iterations on the idea of CommCare. And I remember being a grad student sitting in Seattle, supervising a couple of undergrads. And I was like, oh, we have this idea of CommCare, and why don't you guys create a mock-up of it and do some kind of initial iterations? And I think there was even some design work that we did with some other academics at some point. And we had all of these incredible ideas, this grand ambition about how it was going to be this tool that the health worker was going to pull out and use to plan her whole day. And she's going to schedule all these different things, prioritize this and prioritize that. And then when we got to the field, it was, we've already talked about this, but we had this 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch screen and some clickety clackety buttons to try and do all of this work. And it was totally unreasonable. And, that sort of broader vision of the digital support tool that CommCare could become, I think it's only being realized now, 15 years later or something. So that lesson of the ideas in Seattle and in Boston and in sort of the kind of planning mode, they just didn't really translate once we got to the field and having that sort of field first and having that field experience. I think we've heard it from all the stories today. Like, it's so important, and it grounded us so much in the work and allowed us to create something that's actually functional, actually usable, and can help people solve problems.
Yeah, and I think as a technologist, the thing that's really stuck with me over time, what I love about this space is how collaborative and how kind of like all in it everybody is working together. Like, it's not just participatory design and so like we get something great from it. It's the idea that, when people really want to solve a problem, like, we're willing to do really hard things, right? And, so like we didn't go out to the field and build things with the form builder because like somebody made us, right? Like all of our early users, like we were building that form builder and kind of using it because it helped us, even though it was a hard problem and even though it didn't work great all the time. Like, it was like something we were pushing for. And like, there's something really powerful about our kind of like end users and our app builders and the developers and like the kind of organizations we were working with all kind of being in it together and being able to push through the hard things together and being able to design together and find what's the hardest problem. And I think that's really what has come through from this community. And I think it's a really special thing about Dimagi's approach and about how we've been able to work together, is being able to kind of go to the field and like work with the end users and figure out, okay, we can't do all this. What's the most important thing to work on? And it's the same kind of feedback as, well, the form builder's a disaster. We can't fix everything. Like, what's the most important thing to work on? And I think being able to kind of have that experience and feel like it's not a vendor relationship or like a purely academic relationship, and that we're all trying to do it together, I think is something that has been a really important, powerful part of getting there across all these pieces of the tech. And we couldn't have succeeded without it in almost every area. So I really relish that that's something we've still been able to maintain, and it still feels true with our users today, both kind of in our app builders and all the way down to folks who are using the phones in the field. So I'm hopeful that's something that we can keep carrying forward as we pick up these bigger technology problems.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been honestly really inspiring to me to hear these early stories. And I feel like I've learned a lot. So I'm excited to share this with our audience. And thank you, Clayton, Brian, Neal, Cory, John. Really appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed that deep dive into some of the stories, iterations, and learnings that have made CommCare what it is today. I'll share a quick recap of some of the phases of CommCare's development. So we heard about those earliest years, 2002 to 2008 roughly, which were really kind of the Wild West of Dimagi, where we were trying to build bespoke technology for various projects. We got pretty good at this, but found that it wasn't sustainable for us or our partners. Then we have 2008 and 2009, which was really a turning point moment for Dimagi. And these were the earliest days of working on CommCare, starting in Tanzania and a few other places. This was a time of deep learning with our users. And during this time, the team began to evolve from a focus on bespoke technology, shifting towards more of a product approach. And then in 2016, reaching a place where applications could be built directly on CommCare HQ, which is our web-based application builder. And this is where you heard Clayton share that he reached a point where it felt like what we had created actually was a first-class product. So I'm sure that there's many lessons you're taking away from this. I wanted to share a few of mine. So one, design in context and learn from your users. This is the design under the mango tree approach and has been an essential ingredient to creating something of value at Dimagi. 2, feel the pains of your users. CommCare was developed in remote, low connectivity settings, and so the need for it to be offline capable was built in from day one. 3, pay attention to shifts in technology. Dimagi was able to pivot from PDAs to Nokia brick phones and then to smartphones based on their levels of penetration with our users. 4, embrace the opportunity to go deep. The fact that we built CommCare to meet the needs of hundreds, now thousands of projects means that it brings with it the benefits of that deep work. Case management workflows are an example of a really complex thing to build that we may not have created had we gone for a minimum viable product approach. And 5, lean into collaboration. CommCare is the result of many different types of collaborations between external organizations, between Dimagi team members and CommCare users. These were groups of people coming together and willing to do the hard work needed to solve a shared problem. That's all. Please take a moment to share this show, follow, or leave a rating. It really helps us grow our audience and our impact. Thank you so much.